Good evening, everyone. My name is Geraldine Higgins, and I'm the Director of Irish Studies here at Emory, and I would like to welcome all the Hibernophiles, the Bibliophiles, the Yeatsophiles, everyone who's here tonight to celebrate this wonderful visit from our new Irish Ambassador, Dan Mulhall. As my friend, the poet Bernard O'Donoghue used to say, we're all Irish in the sight of God. Ambassador Mulhall took up his current position in Washington in September 2017 after 5 years as Irish Ambassador to the United Kingdom. With a career in Ireland's diplomatic service stretching back nearly 40 years, he has vast reserves of experience gained in missions from Malaysia to Berlin and from India to the EU. He and his wife, Rita, are sorely missed in London's Irish Embassy, where they were beloved not only for the success of diplomatic visits, such as the state visit of President Michael D. Higgins to London, but also for the hospitality and conviviality of their many cultural gatherings. Ambassador Mulhall has long been a proponent of Ireland as the world's smallest cultural superpower. During Yeats's 150th birthday year in 2015, he tweeted a line of Yeats poetry every day, a practice he has continued with daily quotes that bring Irish poetry right into the heart of everyday life. Our belief here at Emory that literature matters, particularly Irish literature, is at the heart of the mission of initiatives like the W.B. Yeats Foundation, the Beckett Letters, the Collected Letters of W.B. Yeats, and of course, the wonderful Rose Library, which houses significant collections not just of Yeats and his friends, but of his great successor, Seamus Heaney, and his circle of contemporary Irish poets, Michael Longley, Seamus Deane, Derek Mann, Paul Muldoon, Kieran Carson, and Maeve McGuckian, as well as Thomas Kinsella and Edna O'Brien. So now I'm going to take a short ad break, but it's based on the Amazon principle that customers who like this may also like this. Next week, we have at Emory the Eamon Lectures, and the Eamon Lectures in 2017 will be delivered by one of our most distinguished contemporary Irish writers, Colm Tóibín. Tóibín will speak at Emory from November 12th to Tuesday, the November 14th, on the subject of 3 Irish writers and their fathers, Oscar Wilde, W.B. Yeats and James Joyce. So for tonight only, if you do not already have tickets for the Eamon Lectures, you can get tickets outside for free at the desk where our students are there to give you tickets to the Eamon Lectures. But please do come back next week for another wonderful event here at Emory and spread the word. Tonight's lecture begins with a quotation from Yeats's poem To Ireland in the Coming Times. In fact, as many of you know, one of my favourite areas of research is the quotable Yeats. Over the years, I've tracked the quotable Yeats across a wide range of political and popular sources, from Mary Robinson to Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, in fact, whose letters are upstairs, and he quotes Yeats in one of his letters, and from Clint Eastwood to Peanuts and The Sopranos. They have all quoted Yeats. In this far from scientific study, I discovered that the 3 most quoted poems are The Lake Isle of Innisfree, Easter 1916, and The Second Coming. In other words, the only lines of Yeats that you will ever need to know are peace comes dropping slow, a terrible beauty is born, and things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. To my delight, when I was lecturing at the W.B. Yeats Summer School in Sligo, I heard Ambassador Mulhall give a lecture on the strange death of romantic Ireland, in which he conducted an inquest, asking who died, how did it happen, who is responsible, and what were the implications of those events. I'm excited now to hear how the opening lines from To Ireland in the Coming Times, know that I would account it be, true brother of a company that sang to sweeten Ireland's wrong, ballad and story, ran and song. How will this inform our lecture this evening? But before we sing to sweeten Ireland's wrong, I would like to welcome to the podium Atlanta's own ardent supporter of Irish business, sport, entertainment and culture, Consul General Shane Stevens. Consul General Stevens has been the champion of all things Irish in the South East region since he arrived in 2015, and we are very grateful to him for his support in continuing to build ever closer ties between Emory and Ireland. So please put your hands together for Shane Stevens.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. It is once again a very great honour for me to be here at Emory University and to be at an event where we are celebrating and examining Irish literature. Emory is, of course, really a home for, in particular for Irish poetry, but in general for Irish literature, and it's very special to be here. I'm not going to say too much now. I just want to introduce Dan Mulhall, Ireland's ambassador to the United States of America. Dan Mulhall has been our ambassador in Malaysia many years ago, in Berlin, and most recently in London. And I'm very much looking forward to this lecture myself. I know of his reputation as a Yeats scholar, and so I'll just pass over. Thank you very much. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you, Shane, and thank you all for coming here this evening. I'm delighted to see such a great turnout, and I suppose that's testimony to the power of W.B. Yeats and the power of Emory to gather people together in celebration of great writing. And I hope that I can do something at least this evening to maybe get you to think about some of the Yeats issues that have always been of interest to me. But first of all, I'd like to say that it's a great privilege to be Ireland's ambassador in the United States, for very good and obvious reasons that we're extremely well connected here because of the tens of millions of people, Irish people and people of Irish descent who live in this country, are to be found in every walk of life and have made a huge contribution, including by creating this extraordinary partnership between our two countries. We're very lucky also as a country that we have a community of scholars around the world that have concerned themselves with Ireland, because it would be very easy for an island nation like ours to look in on itself and to think that it knew everything about itself that needs to be known. Not the case, clearly. And we're lucky that we have people, distinguished people, some with Irish backgrounds, many with no Irish background, who have devoted themselves to exploring aspects of Ireland's identity, Ireland's history, literature and culture. And I hope that that tradition of Irish studies, so strongly represented here at Emory University, will continue into the future, because no doubt, whatever happens in the world, we will always need to connect our two countries. We'll always need to foster understanding between nations, and there's no better way of fostering understanding between nations than through scholarship, because scholarship is the enemy of prejudice and of narrow-mindedness and intolerance. I want to pay tribute to a number of people, to James Flannery, who's a wonderful scholar of Irish literature, in particular of the work of W.B. Yeats. Rita Ann Higgins, we've just heard speaking, to Ron Schuhauer, who has been important as well in the Irish studies world here at Emory, to Lois Oberbeck, who I first met in London when she came for the launch of one of the volumes of Becca's Letters, and what a wonderful project that is, in which Emory has played such a central role. And of course, Rosemary Magee, I also came across at that same time. So let me start my talk, and I'll start with a reading. And I have it all printed on the page here, but actually I much prefer to read poetry from a book rather than from a piece of typescript. To Ireland in the coming times. Know that I would accounted be true brother of a company that sang to sweeten Ireland's wrong. Ballad and story, ran and song. Nor be I any less of them, because the red rose-bordered hem of her whose history began before God made the angelic clan trails all about the written page. When time began to rant and rage, the measure of her flying feet made Ireland's heart begin to beat, and time bade all his candles flare to light a measure here and there. And may the thoughts of Ireland brood upon a measured quietude. The first verse of To Ireland in the Coming Times. Now, when this poem was first published, was it something I said? In Yeats's 1893 collection, yes, that's better. I can read it without the light, but it's a little more difficult, and I might struggle a bit. The collection was called The Rose. Now, it was neither the best poem in the collection nor the best known poem in the collection, in what was Yeats's first major collection. However, we shouldn't be too hard on To Ireland in the Coming Times, because after all, it was up against pretty stiff competition, because that collection contained two poems, The Lake Alavinish Free and When You Were Old, both of which remain immensely popular to this day. And usually when the BBC or some other international news agency does your favourite poems, these two poems very often get into the top 10, so they're really top of the pops. So it's not surprising that To Ireland in the Coming Times wasn't the most famous poem, or is still not the best known poem from that collection. Yet I've always seen the poem as an important one, and I'm using it this evening as a kind of a point of entry into what I consider to be an important topic, both in literary terms, but also in terms of the history of Ireland, because I've always been fascinated by that intersection between history and literature, which is particularly powerful in the period between 1890 and, say, 1922, when Ireland first became independent. And that was really the age of Yeats. Yeats was the dominant literary and artistic figure in Ireland throughout those decades, and indeed beyond. So, my view, the reason I've chosen this poem as my kind of guiding poem for my talk is that it touches on three of the themes that are key to Yeats's work and life in the 1890s and beyond. And those are the themes of love, mysticism, and Ireland. Now, for those of you who are interested in a greater knowledge or exploration of the poet's relationship with Maud Gonne, or his dabbling in magic or mysticism, I'm going to disappoint you, because the main focus of my talk is the third bit, which is the Ireland bit. Because that's what I've always been interested in, is Yeats as an Irish poet, as a poet who's part of the fabric of Ireland, really, and a poet whose work is essential, really, for an understanding of modern Ireland. So, in February 1890, at the beginning of the 1890s, the decade, and the reason I'm looking at that decade in particular is because Yeats himself, of course, maintained that the 1890s was a crucial decade, because it was his idea that after the fall of Charles Stuart Parnell in 1890, when he became embroiled in a divorce scandal, and his death in 1891, Yeats's idea was that Ireland turned away from the narrowness of politics and became this cultural dynamo, and that cultural movement somehow gave rise to the climate of opinion that produced the Irish Revolution between 1916 and 1921, which led to Irish independence the following year, or to the establishment of the Irish Free State the following year. So I'm looking at the 1890s then as a key decade for Yeats and for Ireland. But it's probably the decade that doesn't get as much attention in Yeats's life, because the later period maybe is more interesting for scholars, the period when his great works were produced, because his best known works are not his greatest works, as many people will agree. But the 1890s was really a formative decade for Yeats. Now, in 1890, he published an essay in the Boston Pilot, which was a Boston newspaper edited by the Irish Fenian, John Boyle O'Reilly. And Yeats liked the publishers there because they paid. And the one theme that runs through the 1890s is the poet's lack of money, in that he was constantly borrowing from people like John O'Leary, his mentor in Dublin, and others, and then having to pay the money back, and then being only able to pay half it back and having to pay the rest of it back later on. And he was always scrimping and saving, trying to cobble together enough money to live on in the London of the 1890s, where he mainly lived during that decade. So in his essay and this essay was on the Irish poet William Allingham, who's mainly known in Ireland for his popular poem, Up the Airy Mountain, Down the Rushy Glen, We Daren't Go Hunting for Fear of Little Men. And it was, he was a sort of a 19th century poet. And Yeats, in writing about Allingham, concluded that he had the makings of a great writer in him, but he lacked, quote, impulse and momentum, which in Yeats's view, these were the very things that national feeling could have supplied. So he says, Allingham, potentially a great poet, but he was lacking something. What was he lacking? National feeling. Because, of course, Allingham would have been unionist in his political affiliations. And in fact, he was often criticised by Catholic Ireland because some of his works were critical of the Catholic Church. So he would have been someone who maybe didn't sort of, like Yeats, embark on this process of being openly and dedicated to his identity as an Irish writer. So Yeats felt that Allingham's problem was that he didn't have the national feeling that would have given him greater energy and momentum. And then he went on with a precocious confidence that only a 24-year-old could possibly come up with, and said, there is no great literature without nationality, and no great nationality without literature. That'd be a good subject for a seminar, wouldn't it? Discuss. That'd be. I recommend that as a possible exam question for some time in the future. And in a way, this idea of the link between nationality and literature runs through Yeats's work throughout the 1890s and indeed beyond. And of course, many people would have disagreed with Yeats in his assertions, but it was a confident statement of a young poet that there is no great literature without nationality and no great nationality without literature. Now, what I want to do is to weigh up the significance of Yeats's activities and his concerns during the 1890s for his work, for his life and his work, and indeed for the Ireland of his time. Now, certainly Yeats in the 1890s showed absolutely no lack of impulse and momentum that he claimed Allingham was lacking in. And definitely Yeats's momentum in the 1890s was driven very largely by what I think you could call national feeling. Now, of course, you have to, in Yeats's case, you have to always examine what these things might mean. But certainly, I don't think there's any doubt but that Yeats had a genuine national feeling in the 1890s. That may have changed in the later decades, but in the 1890s, no doubt, Yeats was a committed Irish nationalist of a fairly advanced character. So the 1890s were, in my view, Yeats's most thoroughly Irish decade, because he was engaged in a whole range of Irish activities, which kept him very busy indeed. And as one of his biographers has said, he was like a slave to literary journalism. He was constantly churning out articles on Irish literature, both for the reasons of propagating this idea of an Irish literature, but also because he needed the money, and at least that was a source of funding when there was no other source available to him. So, and of course, in the 1890s, he had not yet developed this ambivalence about Ireland, which would characterize his later life and indeed would be the basis in many ways for the power of his mature poems of the 1920s and 30s. So, by 1890, he was already recognized as a talented poet. He had published The Wanderings of Oisin and other poems in the 1880s. He'd also come under the influence of the old Fenian John O'Leary. O'Leary was a man who took part in the Fenian Rebellion of the 1860s, was imprisoned in Britain and then exiled to France for quite a few years and came back in the 1880s and became a kind of a national literary kind of convener of the younger generation of Irish writers and of advanced nationalists. And O'Leary convinced Yeats that Ireland should be his theme, and Yeats embraced this idea very, very enthusiastically indeed, even though his own background might not have suggested that he would become committed to being an Irish writer as opposed to a writer who happened to be from Ireland. Now, of course, the closing decade of the 19th century was also an important decade in Irish history. And it's bookended, neatly bookended by two political events. First of all, the fall of Parnell in 1890 and his death in 1891. And then at the end of the century, you had two events. One was the Boer War, which generated a lot of nationalist resistance and pro-Boer sentiment in Ireland, and also the reunification of the parliamentary party under John Redmond. So there were 10 years when the parliamentarians were divided, fighting among themselves about the legacy of Parnell, the Parnellites who supported Parnell and his memory, and the anti-Parnellites who regarded Parnell as someone who had let Ireland down by getting himself embroiled in this messy divorce proceeding. So, now, Yeats, of course, apart from being a great poet, was also a very fine historian. He wouldn't have got a degree in history, certainly. Probably wouldn't have got a degree in literature either, for that matter, because he wasn't a great, he wasn't very, he was a brilliant thinker and a brilliant writer, but he wouldn't have maybe had the discipline to undergo an undergraduate or a postgraduate course in literature or history. But he was a great man for coming up with powerful ideas. And one was the one I mentioned, the idea that what he called the stir of thought that occurred in the 1890s had contributed to the transformation of Ireland. In other words, that culture was at the heart of the Irish Revolution. So, and as early as 1891, indeed, Yeats was talking up the political relevance of the cultural movement in which he was involved. And for example, he saw the literary movement that he was promoting as holding out what he called the flag of truce to all nationalists, offering a neutral ground where the warring political factions could coalesce. So he saw literature as having a capacity, first of all, to bring different traditions, different political factions in Ireland together under the one banner of an Irish literature, and also the capacity to attract people into patriotic activity who were turned off by the squabbling and bitterness of the political world of the 1890s. Now, he was probably exaggerating, but now I'm going to read the second verse of the poem To Ireland in the Coming Times. And this is the one where he deals with his commitment to Ireland. And actually, in the 1890s, while he wrote lots of poems that were set in Ireland, this one is the only poem from the 90s that actually addresses, if you like, the history and politics of Ireland per se. I mean, everything else is more, it conjures up the glories of early Ireland and so forth and the Irish landscape. But this one is specifically a poem that has a political focus, at least in part. And he mentions here Davis, Mangan and Ferguson. That's Thomas Davis, the leader of the Young Ireland movement of the 1840s. Mangan was a poet of the Young Ireland movement, again from the 1840s, that Yeats admired. And then Samuel Ferguson was a unionist, but was one of the first poets in English to use the Irish mythological sagas and try to use them as the basis for a poetry that was written in English but anchored in the Irish tradition. Nor may I less be counted one with Davis, Mangan and Ferguson, because to him who ponders well, my rhymes more than their rhyming tell of things discovered in the deep, where only bodies laid asleep. For the elemental creatures go about my table to and fro, that hurry from unmeasured minds to rant and rage in flood and wind. Yet he who treads in measured ways, may surely barter gaze for gaze. Man ever journeys on with them, after the red rose-bordered hem, our fairies dancing under the moon, a druid land, a druid tune. So here we have Yeats conjuring up the ancient Celtic traditions, the land of the Druids, the ancient scholars of Ireland. So Yeats's guiding idea during the 1890s was the creation of a national literature for Ireland. And he spent considerable time and labour ploughing away, writing these articles in obscure journals, arguing that Ireland needed to have and ought to have its own national literature. He founded in 1891 in London the Irish Literary Society, which still exists to this day, by the way, and I hosted in London every year an annual W.B. Yeats lecture in conjunction with the society that Yeats founded in 1891. And then the following year in Dublin, he helped found the National Literary Society. Now, early on, he got into squabbles because the big issue, really, the big dividing line was between those like Yeats, who saw Irish literature as an aesthetic achievement, an aesthetic realm, and those who saw it as no, it had to serve the needs of the Irish national struggle, or it had to be the handmaiden of politics. It had to be more or less propagandistic, and Yeats had a great aversion to what he regarded as poetry that was more like oratory than poetry. So he was trying to maintain a pristine, or develop a pristine literary tradition, while many around him wanted the poetry and the prose of the Irish literary movement to be much more openly political. And in particular, he came to blows with Charles Gavin Duffy, who was a United Irelander from the 1840s, who'd been exiled to Australia, became Premier of Victoria, and as an old man came back in the 1890s. And of course, Yeats thought he was old-fashioned, an old fogey, who was devoted to an old-fashioned idea of Irish literature, not to the new literature that Yeats was trying to create. But of course, predictably, Duffy won the argument, because while Yeats may have had more literary flair, Duffy had political venerability on his side. He had, after all, suffered transportation and so on, imprisonment in Australia because of his Irish national and nationalist views. And therefore, he had pedigree, and it was very difficult for a young upstart like Yeats to get the better of Duffy. So Yeats tried to argue that William Allingham, whom I've mentioned, and Samuel Ferguson should be the models, if you like, for Irish writing, rather than the two poets that probably at that time were most revered among Irish nationalists. Thomas Davis, I've mentioned already, who wrote A Nation Once Again, that is still a song that most Irish people would know. And, of course, Thomas Moore, of Moore's Melody fame, who was a kind of a Elton John of the early 19th century. Although James Flannery, I know, has done very good work in recovering, because I think Moore deserves actually more more respect than he has been given in recent years. But he was an extremely popular performer in London, and he was renowned really in the salons of early 19th century London. James Joyce, of course, had a go at him in Ulysses, where he passes a statue of Thomas More outside Trinity College, which is over the public toilets in that part of Dublin. So Joyce, or Bloom, comments that it was an appropriate place to put a statue to a man who wrote The Meeting of the Waters. a rather cruel joke at Moore's expense. So anyway, basically his idea was Irish writers should write about Ireland. Simple as that. They should devote themselves to writing about Ireland. He said that Irish writers, until they applied themselves to the needs of Ireland, they would never do anything great in literature. So in other words, if you wanted to be a good writer and you were Irish, you should be devoted to Irish topics. And he talked about wanting to create in Ireland a true, cultivated, patriotic class. So it's a sort of an elitist project, really, it was almost like he wanted to have a cabal of literary people who would kind of guide Ireland and would set the standards for the rest of the population. Anyway, he had to face those who for example, like the great, or at that time, the leading Irish scholar and poet, Edward Dowden, who was an academic at Trinity College, Dublin, who dismissed this idea of Irish literature. It would just be barbaric. It wouldn't have any interest because, of course, in Dowden's view, the way to success as an Irish writer was to command an audience, a cosmopolitan audience around the world. And in Dowden's view, why would anybody want to read writings that were set in Ireland? Now we know, of course, that is actually has been one of the reasons for the success of Irish literature has been that people do want to read material that is set in Ireland because it has a certain quality to it. But Dowden's view was that Irish writers should be cosmopolitan. They shouldn't be narrowly provincial, focused on the limited material that Dowden thought was available in Ireland. So Yeats also had to argue, because of course another issue for Yeats was, well, if you wanted an Irish literature, an Irish national literature, why was it not going to be written in the Irish language? So Yeats, of course, didn't speak Irish, wasn't very good at languages, tried to learn French and failed miserably, it seems. So his idea was that, he wrote at one stage, can we not build up a national tradition, a national literature, which shall be nonetheless Irish in spirit for being English in language? In the 1890s, that worked fine. But later on, of course, Yeats got into more difficulty when those who didn't really care for Yeats's version of Irish literature sought to dismiss him because he didn't represent the true Ireland, because he didn't write in the language in Ireland's traditional language. But Yeats's view was that, as he put it in 1894, he wanted to make criticism as international as possible and literature as national as possible. So the idea was that you'd have a national literature, but you would subject it to standards that would be international. So this was the way he argued the case for Irish literature. And you see in the poem To Ireland in the Coming Times that his basic argument there is that I'm committed to Ireland, but that doesn't mean I'm going to accept a lower standard of writing just because it's Irish. We must subject the work we do to the highest critical standards, but the work should be Irish in spirit. It should be set in Ireland. Now, his passion for Ireland arose out of, I think, a genuine belief on Yeats's part in the 1890s that Ireland was a special case. It was a country that was not sucked in to the late Victorian materialism of that period, to the imperial instincts of that time. That Ireland had a special quality to its history and its mythology. And he wrote at one stage that Ireland possessed, and I quote here, the most moving legends and a history full of lofty passions. If we can but take that history and those legends and turn them into dramas, poems, and stories full of the living soul of the present, and make them massive with conviction and profound with reverie, we may deliver that new great utterance for which the world is waiting. So you can see that Yeats wouldn't have got a degree at my old university or here because he didn't have that kind of academic discipline, but he's a brilliant writer and a brilliant critic and a brilliant historian as well because of the way he managed. I mean, Easter 1916, it's very hard now to look back at the Easter Rising without thinking of Yeats's analysis of the Rising, written a few months after the event and containing much of what we still today weigh up. So he had no lack of ambition for Ireland, shall we say. And it was possible in the 1890s to have this kind of lofty notion. Yeats thought that Ireland could be the home of idealism and that it would resist the materialism of other parts of Europe, and that it would be a place where these special qualities, this special tradition could be brought into the modern world and could save the modern world by reminding the modern world of the idealism that was embedded in the Irish tradition. So now I think the 1890s was the decade when Yeats came closest to being a conventional political activist. And he appears, although it's not certain, but he appears to have taken the oath of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was a secret society, an oath-bound secret society. Yeats liked secret cabals of that kind, so he obviously never intended, I'm sure, to do anything about this, but he, I think, was probably was a bit, I'm sure he was chuffed at the idea of being part of a secret society and taking an oath, because it gelled nicely with his own mysticism and his own interest in occult religions and so forth. But towards the end of the decade, he became involved in the commemoration, the centenary commemoration of the United Irishmen's Rebellion of 1798. And in fact, he became the chairman of the 1798 Centenary Commemoration Committee of England and France. It was probably a loftier title than the reality probably suggested. But nonetheless, he was active in that advanced nationalist cause of trying to remember the Rising of 1798, which is the basic, it is the foundation stone really of modern Irish nationalism, modern Irish republicanism. So, and then he opposed the Boer War. He wrote to the newspapers in Britain and Ireland opposing the Boer War, which is not an easy thing to do, because at that time we were, remember, in the high imperial period, when all things imperial were regarded as sort of saintly. And for Yeats to challenge, as a man who was spending most of his life in Britain and obviously had a lot of admirers among the English reading public, to challenge the Boer War was a fairly brave act. And then finally, in 1900, he took a public position. He wrote again to the newspapers condemning the visit to Ireland of Queen Victoria. And considering the Queen at that stage was in her 80s, had been over 60 years on the throne, had been venerated in her Golden Jubilee of 1887 and the Diamond Jubilee of 1897, for him to publicly rebuke the Queen. And he said that her visit, which he claimed that her advisors had put her up to, that the lady herself wouldn't have wanted to come, but they forced her, 82-year-old or 83-year-old woman, to visit Ireland in April of 1900 in order to assist the recruiting effort for the Boer War. And he said that it was prompted by, and I quote, national hatred of our individual national life. So he accused Queen Victoria, venerable Queen at that time, of being involved in national hatred, in a hatred of Ireland's national life. So, brave enough thing to do for somebody at that time. In 1898, at a banquet in honour of the leader of the rising 100 years before, Wolfe Tone, which was held in London, mainly attended by people of Irish descent, or Irish people of Irish descent, he spoke with an unbridled nationalist enthusiasm of the need to, and I quote, reawaken our country after a great disillusionment. He was convinced that Ireland was coming to her own and better self by turning to subtler sources of national feeling than are in politics. He concluded, we are building up a nation which shall be moved by noble purposes to noble ends. So, genuine nationalist passion here. And then towards the end of the century again, he got involved in creating a national theatrical movement, which became eventually the Abbey Theatre in 1904. But it was founded in 1899 as the Irish Literary Theatre. And the purpose of that was to counteract the influence of music hall and English popular theatre, because many theatres in Dublin actually took shows over from London and elsewhere, and essentially were very anglicised in their outlook. And Yeats wanted to create a national theatre. And he said that he wanted to show that, quote, Ireland is not the home of buffoonery and easy sentiment, but the home of ancient idealism. There you are again. Idealism coming up against, in conflict with the materialism of late Victorian England. Now, I want to, and then finally, I'm going to extend the 1890s into the early 20th century, because I think there's a natural cutoff point for Yeats's 1890s. Everyone's 1890s will be different, but Yeats's probably finish in 1902 with the first production of Yeats's hyper-nationalistic play, Kathleen Ní Houlihan. I just saw a copy of an early edition of Kathleen Ní Houlihan upstairs in the library, a wonderful artifact indeed. But Kathleen Ní Houlihan is a play set at the time of the 1798 rebellion. And it has this old woman who comes into a home and basically tells the people in the house, I want my fields have been taken away from me, I want my fields back. And of course, Maud Gonne played the role of the old woman. She was a very young woman at the time, but she played a relatively young woman. She played the role of the old woman. And of course, when she leaves the house, after inspiring the household to go and fight for Ireland, she was the personification of Ireland. She walked down the pathway and somebody came in and I was asked, did you see the old lady? And the answer was, no, it wasn't an old lady. It was a young woman and she had the walk of a queen. So it was this hyper-nationalistic play, which afterwards, of course, Yeats wrote in one of his later poems, did a play of mine send out certain men the English shot? Again, writing himself into history, probably exaggerating somewhat. But one person who saw it when it was first produced in the early 20th century, I think it was Stephen Gwynn, wrote that it's the kind of play you shouldn't see unless you were willing to go out and fight. So it was a fairly incendiary piece of writing. So that, I think, brings to a close Yeats's sort of 1890s. And I want to just go to the following year. In fact, 1904. Yeats spent the end of 1903 and into 1904 on tour in America, right? And by the time he came to America, he was beginning to get a bit jaundiced in his views of Ireland. He was beginning to get a bit sceptical. Would the romantic ambitions he had for Ireland, could they be fulfilled in the Ireland of the 20th century? He was excited about Ireland's potential throughout the 1890s and the turn of the century, but he started to have doubts about the direction of travel in Ireland from 1903 onwards, let's say. But when he came to America, he went on tour. He toured all over the country and he attracted huge audiences. I mean, I gave a speech recently at a Robert Emmet commemoration. Emmet was the Irish revolutionary, the Irish Republican figure from 1803 who led a hopeless revolt and was executed and became a kind of a poster nationalist really for generations afterwards, and particularly in America where he seemed to have a huge following. Anyway, Yeats gave a talk about Emmet on the anniversary of his death, of his execution. This was in 1904 in a big venue in New York, and 4,500 people turned up. Extraordinary. But all over America, he got big crowds. He was obviously quite a good lecturer, and he played to the gallery. We all do that, I suppose, a little bit. I think he probably turned the clock back a bit and probably expressed views that he would have had more genuinely 4 or 5 years before. But I want to quote what he said in New York as a kind of a summary, really, of Yeats's, what I call his fin de siècle Irish nationalism. And by the way, this has an Emory connection because I don't have access, obviously, to primary material. I don't have time to be doing these things, doing much research. I have to rely on my own knowledge and also on my own collection of books, which is quite significant, but not by any means what a university would have. So one of my favorite books is Richard Ellman's W.B. Yeats' The Man in the Masks. And when I was preparing for this talk, I went back and read it again. And it's a great book. And I know Richard Ellman was distinguished professor here for 7 years in the 1980s. And is really one of the fathers of modern Irish studies. He also is the author of the great biography of James Joyce, which still hasn't been bettered nearly 50 years or more after Ellman first wrote the book. But anyway, this speech he delivered in New York in 1904. And he talked about, and I'm going to read this, it's about half a page, so it's a bit longer than I would normally do. He talked about Ireland's relations with England as what he called a war between two civilizations, two ideals of life, right? And here's what he said. We Irish do not desire, like the English, to build up a nation where there shall be a very rich class and a very poor class. Ireland will always be, in the main, an agricultural country. Wherever men have tried to imagine a perfect life, they have imagined a place where men plough and sow and reap, not a place where there are great wheels turning and great chimneys vomiting smoke. Where there will be an imaginative culture and power to understand imaginative and spiritual things distributed among the people. We wish to preserve an ancient ideal of life. In Ireland alone among the nations, that, as you know, you will find away on the western seaboard, under broken roofs, a race of gentlemen that keep alive the ideals of a great time when men sang the heroic life with drawn swords in their hands. Now, I can't help comparing that. That is, in my view, classic fin de siècle Irish nationalism. Late 19th century Irish nationalism. Idealistic, focused on rural Ireland, on Ireland's special mission in the world and so forth. And I cannot read that passage without thinking of a famous speech 43 years later, or 40 years later, given by Eamon de Valera, then Prime Minister, Taoiseach of Ireland, in a St. Patrick's Day broadcast to the Irish in America, to whom Yeats was also speaking in 1904. Of course, he was speaking to people at home as well. It was broadcast on RT and broadcast internationally. Because De Valera talked about Ireland being the Ireland we dreamed of, the home of a people who valued material wealth only as a basis for right living, and who devoted their leisure to the things of the spirit. So it seems to me that De Valera, who was a young man in 1904, imbibed that turn of the century Irish zeitgeist, this kind of romantic cultural nationalism with a focus on rural Ireland and an aversion to the modern world and to all things English, which De Valera, 40 years later, was still talking about as his vision of Ireland. So it shows how powerful that zeitgeist was, that it shaped the minds not only of Yeats, but also of people like De Valera and others from that time who persisted with that vision, that pastoral vision of Ireland, long after it had become somewhat redundant. And of course, it took someone like Patrick Kavanagh, who lived in rural Ireland, to write about the great hunger as he saw it, the penury and the austerities of life in rural Ireland, to kind of debunk this kind of myth-making that De Valera and others engaged in. This is the last stanza of To Ireland in the Coming Times. While still I may, I write for you the love I lived, the dream I knew. From our birthday until we die is but the winking of an eye, and we, our singing and our love, what measurer time has lit above, and all benighted things that go about my table to and fro, are passing on to where may be, in truth's consuming ecstasy, no place for love and dream at all. For God goes by with white footfall. I cast my heart into my rhymes, that you, in the dim coming times, may know how my heart went with them after the red rose-bordered hem. So my conclusion then is what to make of Yeats's life and work during the 1890s. It was a decade that saw his emergence as a major poet with two outstanding collections, The Rose and in 1899, The Wind Among the Reeds. I also saw an original copy of that upstairs, and thank you for that. First time I've ever seen such an artifact. And they contain some of the most famous of Yeats's poems. The Song of Wandering Aengus and When You Were Old, The Lake Oliver Is Free, and so forth. He also became a public figure, and he devoted himself single-handedly to engineering and proselytizing for this national literature for Ireland. He became a public figure, involving himself in a range of cultural and political activities. And at the turn of the century, he brought into being an Irish theatrical movement that culminated in the establishment of the Abbey Theatre in 1904. How genuine was Yeats's nationalism? Genuine enough, I would say. Genuine enough. Obviously, he's never going to be your conventional sort of figure. I mean, he wouldn't have been a great poet had he been a conventional figure. So I would say he was an eccentric, exotic, and esoteric nationalist. An individual talent who was both part of and apart from the national tradition as it evolved at that time. His energetic involvement with nationalist Ireland serves to illustrate what a broad church Irish nationalism was in the 1890s, that it could attract people like W.B. Yeats into the fold, where on the basis of his family background, he shouldn't really have been instinctively in tune with the nationalism of late 19th century Ireland, but he was. It was an era in which Yeats could comfortably combine his nationalism and his mysticism. He could see his work in Ireland as part of what he called the revolt of the soul against the intellect. the revolt of an older tradition against the modern world. So Yeats was a kind of a reactionary in that sense, wanted to recreate older glories as he saw them. And what did involvement in Irish affairs do for Yeats? It seems to me that he was energized by his engagement in Ireland. Without the activities he indulged in the 1890s, could easily have become a rather remote, effete poet. That was his natural default position, I would say. But curiously, for a man who went around in a black cape and tried to look a poet all the time, he was a very active and dedicated and dogged committee member who always wanted to dominate every committee he was involved in. So I think the hurly-burly of the cultural and national issues he became involved in the 1890s did a lot for his development. He believed that great things could be achieved, that Ireland was in a malleable state, that it could be the saviour of idealism in an increasingly materialistic world. And for Yeats, that was a cause worth fighting for. Now, what wider effect did cultural nationalism have? Much, of course, can be made of the fact that there were 3 poets among the 7 signatories of the proclamation of 1916, Easter Rising, and that many other people who took part in the Rising were drawn into political activity, revolutionary activity, through their membership of the Gaelic League, founded in 1893 by Douglas Hyde. Now, the literary movement was clearly less influential than the Gaelic League or the Gaelic Athletic Association, many of whose activists became involved in the Rising and in the events that followed. But I would say Yeats and his movement were part of and contributors to what I call, mixing languages a bit here, 3 languages in one phrase, the fin de siècle Irish zeitgeist, that was part of a wider transformation of Irish attitudes and of Irish affairs in the 1890s and into the 20th century, and which ultimately so created the climate in which the Easter Rising became possible. Although I would have to say that the key event in bringing about the Easter Rising was not the cultural movements that were there, but rather the outbreak of the First World War and the failure of the Home Rule project. Once the war broke out and Home Rule was deferred, it seems to me that was the end of the line for the Home Rule movement. So I would see to Ireland in the coming times as a manifesto for Yeats's future, with its insistence that he could sweeten Ireland's wrong, could write for Ireland, about Ireland, in an Irish literary tradition, without in any way compromising his artistic credo. That he could, committed to Ireland be, and yet could produce rhymes that, as he said, more than their rhyming tell of things discovered in the deep. This alliance of poetry and politics and history would be sorely tested in the decades that followed, when Ireland's affairs were marked by anything but the measured quietude that Yeats wrote about into Ireland in the coming times. So Yeats, in the 1890s, was immersed in the idea of Ireland having a special mission in the world and of Irish literature having a capacity to do something special for Ireland and for literature. In the 20th century, he would become a subject or a person who was deeply disillusioned with Ireland. But it was that disillusionment that actually produced some of his greatest writings in the second, third, and fourth decades of the 20th century. Thank you very much.